At 6:30 a.m. on February 16, 1944, Private First Class Robert Chen crouched in a foxhole 3 miles south of Aprilia, watching German artillery shells tear apart the muddy ground around his position. 22 years old, 4 weeks at Anzio, 0 nights of uninterrupted sleep. The Germans had massed 6 divisions with 370 artillery pieces for Operation Fischfang, their largest counterattack since the Allied landings 3 weeks earlier. Chen belonged to the 45th Infantry Division, positioned directly in the path of the main German assault down the Via Anziate. By mid-February, his battalion had already lost 147 men. The Germans had been probing their lines for days, testing defenses, searching for weak points. Everyone knew the real attack was coming. Nobody knew when. At 6:28 a.m., the bombardment stopped. 2 minutes of complete silence. Then Chen heard it. Tank engines, dozens of them, moving through the fog toward American positions. But the 45th Division faced a problem that went beyond superior German firepower. The Anzio beachhead sat on reclaimed marshland. Winter rains had turned the battlefield into a swamp. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks became anchored in mud up to their axles. Foxholes filled with water faster than soldiers could bail them out. The entire beachhead had become a killing ground where mobility meant survival, and nobody could move. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood this tactical reality. If his panzers couldn't maneuver in the mud, he needed a different approach. Something smaller. Something that could navigate through conditions that stopped conventional armor. Something the Allies had never seen before. Hitler had authorized the deployment of a secret weapon specifically for the Anzio offensive. The Wehrmacht called it Leichter Ladungsträger Goliath, a remote-controlled tracked mine carrying 60 kilograms of high explosives, 39 inches long, controlled by a joystick connected through 650 meters of cable, designed to crawl under enemy tanks, through barbed wire, across minefields. A disposable robot that could deliver a devastating payload without risking a single German soldier. The Goliath represented cutting-edge military technology in 1944. Electric motors powered by onboard batteries, remote steering through a triple-strand control cable, the ancestor of every modern combat drone. Over 7,000 had been manufactured by February 1944. Most had been held in reserve, waiting for the perfect tactical opportunity. Anzio was supposed to be that opportunity. The confined beachhead, the muddy terrain that limited Allied maneuverability, the concentrated American positions. The Goliath seemed ideal for these exact conditions. Break through the barbed wire, destroy the pillboxes, clear paths for the infantry assault. Infantry Layer Regiment received 13 Goliaths for the opening phase of Operation Fischfang. The 813th Engineer Company deployed them under cover of darkness on the night of February 15th, positioning each one in camouflaged bunkers along the assault route. The plan was straightforward. At H hour, German operators would guide the Goliaths forward through the American defenses, while conventional forces followed the paths they cleared. At 6:32 a.m., the first Goliath emerged from its bunker. Chen saw it immediately. A small, tracked vehicle, barely visible through the morning fog, crawling toward his position at walking speed. No visible crew, no turret, just a low-profile box on tracks with a cable trailing behind it. If you want to see how Chen's battalion dealt with Germany's secret weapon, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Chen. He raised his M1 Garand, aimed at the strange vehicle approaching through the mud. Before he could fire, the Goliath stopped moving. Its tracks spun uselessly. The remote-controlled mine had traveled exactly 43 feet from its bunker before the soft ground stopped it completely. The cable behind it went slack. Somewhere in the German lines, an operator moved his joystick frantically, trying to free the trapped machine. 12 more Goliaths launched that morning. Each one traveled between 30 and 70 feet before sinking into the Anzio mud. Not one reached the American lines. Not one delivered its explosive payload. Hitler's wonder weapon, designed to revolutionize warfare, had been defeated by the same conditions that plagued both armies. The question was, what would happen when American soldiers reached those stranded bombs? By 7:15 a.m., the German infantry assault had pushed the 45th Division back 400 yards. The attack concentrated on a narrow front, just 3.5 miles wide, hitting the boundary between the 157th and 179th Infantry Regiments, the exact weak point Kesselring had identified. Chen's company retreated under heavy fire, falling back to secondary positions. As they withdrew, soldiers noticed the small tracked vehicles scattered across no man's land. 13 of them, motionless, cables stretching back toward German lines. Nobody knew what they were. Nobody wanted to get close enough to find out. First Lieutenant James Morrison commanded the battalion intelligence section. His orders were clear. Identify the unknown German equipment. Determine if it posed an immediate threat. Report findings to 6th Corps headquarters before noon. Morrison assembled a 4-man patrol at 0745. Sergeant Victor Palmieri led the team, 26 years old, 3 campaigns in the Mediterranean theater, the kind of soldier who volunteered for dangerous assignments because someone had to do them. The patrol crawled through mud toward the nearest Goliath at 0800. German snipers controlled the high ground near Aprilia. Any movement in the open drew immediate fire. Palmieri's team moved 15 yards at a time, stopping between advances to scan for enemy observers. It took them 23 minutes to reach the first device. Palmieri examined it carefully from 3 feet away. The vehicle sat tilted at a 15-degree angle, its left track buried 8 inches deep in soft earth. The control cable was still attached, still taut, which meant German operators might still be trying to detonate it remotely. The Goliath's construction puzzled him. Mild steel armor plating, maybe 5 millimeters thick. 2 small electric motors visible through gaps in the rear hull. A large rectangular compartment in the forward section sealed with bolts. And that cable. 3 separate wires twisted together, disappearing into the vehicle's interior. Palmieri made a decision. They needed to bring one back for examination, but moving it meant potentially triggering whatever explosive charge it carried. The question was whether the Germans could still activate it remotely or whether the electrical connection had failed when the vehicle bogged down. He crawled forward, reached for the cable, and pulled. The wire came free from the Goliath with minimal resistance. The connection had broken, either during deployment or when the vehicle became stuck. Palmieri signaled his team forward. 4 men struggled to lift the disabled Goliath. It weighed 370 kilograms, 815 pounds, far too heavy to carry across 400 yards of open ground under sniper fire. They needed a different approach. By 0930, Palmieri had improvised a solution. The patrol stripped 2 canvas shelter halves from their packs, threaded wooden poles through the grommets, and created a makeshift stretcher. They loaded the Goliath onto it like a casualty evacuation. Then, they began the slow crawl back toward American lines. German observers spotted the movement at 0942. Machine gun fire tore through the mud around Palmieri's team. They dropped flat, the Goliath still balanced on the stretcher between them. For 11 minutes they remained motionless while German gunners swept the area with sustained bursts. At 0953, American artillery opened up on the German positions. The counter-battery fire lasted 6 minutes. Palmieri used the cover to move his team another 40 yards. Stop. Wait. Move again. 40 more yards. The shelter half stretcher was disintegrating under the Goliath's weight. They reached friendly lines at 10:27 a.m. Battalion intelligence immediately took possession of the captured device. Morrison examined it with growing concern. The forward compartment was definitely an explosive container, but the detonation mechanism remained unclear. Cable activated? Timer-based? Pressure-sensitive? 6th Corps Ordnance arrived at 11:15. Sergeant Lester Sachs, an ordnance specialist from Brooklyn, began a careful examination of the Goliath. He identified the battery pack, the dual electric motors, the steering mechanism controlled by differential braking on the tracks, and then he found the explosive charge compartment. Sachs worked slowly, documenting each component. The Goliath carried 60 kilograms of high explosives in its nose section. The detonation system used the 3rd wire in the control cable. Simple, effective, completely dependent on maintaining electrical connection to the operator's control box, which meant all 13 Goliaths scattered across the battlefield were now inert. The broken cables had rendered them harmless. Hitler's wonder weapon had failed not once, but twice. First, the mud stopped their advance. Second, the same mud that trapped them had severed their control connections. But Sachs discovered something else, something that changed 6th Corps' understanding of German capabilities at Anzio. The Goliath wasn't alone. By 1300 hours, American patrols had recovered 9 more Goliaths from the battlefield. Each one told the same story. Tracks buried in mud, control cables severed, explosive payloads intact, but impossible to detonate remotely. The remaining 3 devices had been destroyed by Allied artillery fire during the morning bombardment. Morrison compiled his intelligence report for 6th Corps headquarters. 13 remote-controlled demolition vehicles deployed. 13 failures. 0 successful detonations. 0 American casualties from the secret weapon. The Germans had invested significant resources in a technology that couldn't function in the exact terrain conditions where they chose to deploy it. But Sachs made a disturbing discovery while examining the 4th recovered Goliath. The manufacturing date stamped on the battery housing read November 1943, production number 4216, which meant the Germans had built thousands of these devices before Anzio, which meant 13 Goliaths represented a tiny fraction of their remote-controlled arsenal. The question shifted from what the Goliaths were to where else the Germans planned to use them. Normandy was 6 months away. Allied planners were already studying French beach defenses. If the Germans deployed hundreds of Goliaths on the invasion beaches, and if those beaches weren't muddy marshland like Anzio, the weapons might actually work as designed. 6th Corps intelligence forwarded the captured Goliaths to Allied headquarters in Naples by 1400 hours. Engineers would disassemble them completely, photograph every component, write technical bulletins warning invasion forces what to expect. The Anzio failure had provided valuable intelligence for future operations, but the immediate tactical situation at Anzio was deteriorating rapidly. The Goliaths had failed, but the German offensive had not. By 1500 hours on February 16th, enemy forces had advanced nearly 1 mile into the Allied beachhead. The 45th Division was fighting for survival against overwhelming numbers. Chen's company had fallen back to the final defensive line by 1600 hours. German infantry, supported by Tiger tanks, were pushing south down the Via Anziate. The American line was bending. In some sectors, it was breaking. 6th Corps commander, General John Lucas, committed his last reserves, the 1st Armored Division's Sherman tanks, to plug the gaps. The battle that day cost the Allies 3,500 casualties. The Germans lost 5,400 men. Both sides were bleeding heavily on a narrow front where artillery dominated every engagement. The failed Goliath attack had become a footnote to the larger catastrophe unfolding at Anzio. Morrison watched from battalion headquarters as German forces consolidated their gains. They had driven a wedge 1 mile deep and 3 miles wide into Allied defenses. The beachhead perimeter had shrunk dangerously. Naval gunfire from ships offshore and concentrated artillery from 6th Corps batteries had barely stopped the German advance. Another push like this, and the Allies might be driven into the sea. The Goliaths had failed completely, but they represented only one element of the German attack plan. Infantry Lair Regiment had tested other new equipment during Operation Fischfang. Borgward 4 remote-controlled vehicles, larger than the Goliaths, carrying 450 kilograms of explosives. Panther tanks making their debut in Italy. Ferdinand tank destroyers with 88mm guns. Most of this equipment had also failed in the Anzio mud, but the Germans were learning, adapting. By 1700 hours, they had shifted tactics. Instead of relying on mobility and new technology, they were reverting to massed infantry assaults supported by artillery. The old methods, the proven methods, the methods that didn't care about mud. Chen spent that night in a waterlogged foxhole 400 yards from German positions. He could hear enemy soldiers digging in across no man's land, preparing for another attack. The battle for Anzio was far from over. Operation Fischfang would continue for 4 more days. The Goliaths sat in a Naples warehouse, being photographed and cataloged. One of them would eventually end up at the Patton Museum in Kentucky, another at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Physical evidence of the day Germany's wonder weapon became scrap metal. But for the soldiers still fighting at Anzio, the failed robot mines meant nothing. The Germans were coming again at dawn. This time without their secret weapon. This time with everything else they had. And the mud that had saved the 45th Division from the Goliaths would not stop conventional infantry and artillery. The real question was whether the beachhead could survive 4 more days of this. February 17th began with another German barrage at 0600. 400 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across the Anzio front. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Chen's foxhole collapsed twice from near misses. Each time, he dug himself out and waited for the shells to stop falling. The second wave of Operation Fischfang hit at 0730. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and 26th Panzer Division, both held in reserve during the first day's attack, now joined the assault. Kesselring was committing everything. 10 German divisions against 4.5 Allied divisions on the beachhead. The 45th Division faced a desperate tactical problem. Their defensive line stretched across 4 miles of front. They had already lost 200 men the previous day. Ammunition stocks were running critically low, and the Germans were attacking with fresh troops who hadn't spent the last 4 weeks living in muddy foxholes under constant artillery fire. By 0900, German forces had pushed another 300 yards into American positions. The penetration was deepening. The salient Kesselring had driven into Allied defenses now threatened to split the beachhead in half. If the Germans reached the coast, they would cut 6th Corps into 2 isolated pockets. Then they could destroy each piece separately. Morrison received orders at 0930 to abandon the battalion command post. German infantry was within 200 yards. The headquarters staff grabbed radios, maps, and codebooks, then retreated 500 yards south to a backup position near Padiglione Woods. They left everything else behind. Chen's company counterattacked at 10:15. Orders from division headquarters: retake the lost ground, push the Germans back. Impossible orders, but orders nonetheless. 63 men advanced across open terrain against entrenched enemy positions supported by machine guns and mortars. They made it 40 yards before German fire pinned them down. Chen pressed himself into a shallow depression that provided maybe 6 inches of cover. Bullets snapped overhead. Mortar rounds exploded in the mud around him. He could see dead Americans from the first wave lying where they had fallen. The counterattack failed by 10:45. Chen's company withdrew to their starting positions. They had lost 17 men in 30 minutes, gained 0 ground. The German advance continued. But something was changing in the German offensive. Morrison noticed it first from his new command post. The enemy assault was slowing, not stopping, just losing momentum. The initial rush down the Via Anziate had carried German forces nearly a mile in 24 hours. Now they were measuring advances in yards instead of hundreds of yards. Allied artillery was the primary factor. 6th Corps had concentrated every available gun on the narrow salient. The Germans estimated they faced 20-1 artillery superiority. Every German position received continuous bombardment. Every German advance moved through a steel curtain of high explosive shells. The mud that trapped vehicles also trapped soldiers trying to dig in. Naval gunfire added to the German problems. Destroyers offshore could reach targets 6 miles inland. Their 5-inch guns provided precision fire support, destroying German artillery positions that 6th Corps batteries couldn't reach. The Germans had no answer to this naval advantage. By 1400 hours on February 17th, the German offensive had stalled. Not collapsed, not retreated, just stopped advancing. Both sides held positions separated by 50 to 200 yards across most of the front. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides had taken horrific casualties. Chen used the lull to improve his foxhole. He scraped mud from the bottom, reinforced the walls with wooden boards salvaged from a destroyed building, covered the top with a shelter half. It wasn't much, but it was better than the hole he had started with 48 hours earlier. The Goliaths were forgotten. Nobody in the 45th Division cared about disabled robot mines when German infantry was trying to kill them with rifles and grenades. The wonder weapon had become irrelevant the moment it failed. War moved too fast for reflection on interesting failures. Morrison filed updated intelligence reports throughout the afternoon. German casualties estimated at 5,400 for the first 2 days of Operation Fischfang. Allied casualties at 3,500. The Germans were losing men at a higher rate, but they had more men to lose. The mathematics of attrition favored whoever could sustain losses longer. At 1800 hours, 6th Corps headquarters issued new defensive orders. Hold present positions. No further counterattacks. Conserve ammunition. Wait for German exhaustion. The Allies couldn't win this battle through offensive action. They had to survive it through defensive stubbornness. Night fell over Anzio at 1900 hours. Chen sat in his foxhole eating cold sea rations and listening to German soldiers across no man's land doing the same thing. Both armies were stuck in the same mud, suffering from the same conditions, wondering if tomorrow would bring another assault or blessed quiet. The Goliaths had promised a quick breakthrough. Instead, Operation Fischfang was becoming a grinding battle of attrition where neither side could gain decisive advantage. The wonder weapon had failed. Now both armies faced the brutal reality that sometimes wars are won by whoever refuses to quit. February 18th brought the heaviest German assault of Operation Fischfang. Kesselring threw the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and elements of the 4th Parachute Division into the attack at 0600. He was gambling everything on breaking through before Allied reinforcements arrived, or his own forces collapsed from exhaustion. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division joined the morning assault. The 715th Infantry Division attacked from the west. The 114th Jaeger Division pushed from the east. The entire German 14th Army was committed to destroying the Anzio beachhead. This was the decisive moment Kesselring had promised Hitler. Chen's sector received the full weight of a battalion-strength attack at 0645. German infantry emerged from the morning fog in waves. The first line went down under American rifle and machine gun fire. The second line kept coming. The third line reached American positions, and brutal close combat erupted across the defensive line. By 0800, German soldiers had penetrated 200 yards into the 45th Division sector. American positions were being overrun. Companies that had started the battle with 150 men were down to 40 or 50 effectives. The line was breaking in multiple places simultaneously. Morrison called for artillery support at 0815. Every available gun in 6th Corps responded. 155mm howitzers fired at maximum rate. Naval destroyers offshore poured 5-inch shells into German assembly areas. The barrage created a curtain of steel between the German spearhead and their supporting forces. The artillery bombardment lasted 40 minutes. When it lifted at 0855, the German advance had stopped. Not because they lacked will, not because they lacked courage, but because the casualties had become unsustainable. German after-action reports would later describe the Allied firepower as overwhelming, unprecedented, impossible to overcome. Chen's company held their position by 0930. Barely. They had given up 50 yards of ground, but maintained cohesion. The German infantry that had penetrated their lines were now cut off, surrounded, and being systematically eliminated by American counterattacks. The battle continued throughout February 18th, but the character had changed. The Germans were no longer advancing. They were trying to hold what they had gained. Every German position was under constant artillery fire. Every German movement drew immediate response from Allied observers coordinating naval gunfire. By 1600 hours, 6th Corps committed its final reserve. The 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A launched a counterattack with 100 Sherman tanks. The objective was limited: restore the defensive line, eliminate German penetrations, not breakthrough, not pursuit, just stabilization. The American armor attack succeeded by 1800 hours. German forces withdrew 400 yards to consolidate their positions. The deepest penetration of Operation Fischfang had been eliminated. The Anzio beachhead remained intact. The German offensive had failed to achieve its primary objective. February 19th saw reduced German activity, scattered attacks, probing assaults, artillery exchanges, but no major offensive operations. Kesselring was reassessing. His divisions had suffered catastrophic casualties. The 715th Division reported losing 50% of its effective strength. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division was combat ineffective. Morrison compiled casualty figures from prisoner interrogations. The Germans had lost approximately 5,400 men between February 16th and 19th. Allied losses stood at 3,500. Both numbers were horrific for 4 days of fighting on a narrow front, but the Germans had failed to break the beachhead. February 20th brought the final German assault of Operation Fischfang, a last desperate attempt to salvage something from the offensive. The attack began at 0700 and lasted 6 hours. By 1300 hours, it had collapsed under Allied artillery fire. German units pulled back to defensive positions. The offensive was over. Chen survived all 5 days. His company had started Operation Fischfang with 148 men. 82 remained combat effective on February 20th. 66 casualties in less than a week. Those numbers were typical across the 45th Division. The Goliaths remained in Allied custody. Intelligence officers were writing detailed technical reports on their construction, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. The devices would appear in training manuals issued to troops preparing for the Normandy invasion. Allied soldiers would know what to expect if they encountered similar weapons on French beaches. But at Anzio, the wonder weapon's failure had proven insignificant compared to the larger battle. The Germans had attacked with 10 divisions. They had deployed their newest tanks, their most experienced troops, their heaviest artillery. They had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, and they had failed to destroy the beachhead. The mud that stopped the Goliaths had also stopped German armor. The same conditions that rendered the remote-controlled mines useless had limited panzer mobility throughout the offensive. Nature had fought for the Allies at Anzio. Rain, mud, reclaimed marshland turning back into swamp under the weight of military traffic. Morrison sat in the battalion command post on the evening of February 20th, writing his after-action report. Operation Fischfang had cost the Allies 3,500 casualties and brought the beachhead to the edge of catastrophe. But the line had held. 6th Corps remained in Italy. The road to Rome stayed open. The question now was what would happen during the next 3 months before the breakout. The week after Operation Fischfang ended brought a strange quiet to Anzio. Both armies dug in. Both sides reinforced defensive positions. Both commanders understood that neither force could sustain another offensive like the one that had just failed. The beachhead settled into a static war of artillery duels and patrol actions. Chen's company rotated to a reserve position on February 23rd. They had spent 9 consecutive days on the front line. The relief was temporary. 3 days rest, then back to the foxholes. But 3 days without German artillery fire felt like a vacation. The 45th Division suffered 75% casualties during Operation Fischfang. 2,300 men killed, wounded, or missing from an initial strength of 3,100. The division would need 6 weeks to absorb replacements and restore combat effectiveness. Most veteran units at Anzio faced similar reconstitution requirements. Morrison received promotion to captain on February 25th. The battalion commander who had authorized his promotion was dead, killed by German artillery on February 19th. Morrison now commanded the intelligence section of a battalion that had lost 60% of its officers in less than 2 weeks. 6th Corps headquarters issued new defensive doctrine on February 26th. The lessons of Operation Fischfang were being incorporated into training. Concentrate artillery on narrow fronts. Maintain mobile reserves. Use naval gunfire to maximum effect. Accept temporary penetrations if they can be isolated and eliminated by counterattack. The Goliaths appeared in Allied intelligence bulletins on March 1st. Technical specifications, photographs of captured devices, warnings about potential employment on invasion beaches. Countermeasures were simple. Artillery fire would destroy them. Small arms fire could sever control cables, and any muddy terrain would render them immobile. German intelligence was conducting its own analysis. The Goliath program had cost 3,000 Reichsmarks per vehicle. Over 7,000 had been manufactured by February 1944. The 13 deployed at Anzio represented an investment of 39,000 Reichsmarks, all of it wasted when the devices bogged down in conditions that should have been anticipated. The 813th Engineer Company, the unit that had deployed the Goliaths, was reassigned to the Eastern Front in March 1944. Their specialized equipment was withdrawn from Italy. The Wehrmacht had concluded that remote-controlled demolition vehicles required hard ground to function effectively. Anzio's reclaimed marshland had been the wrong battlefield for the technology, but the Germans continued Goliath production through September 1944. The devices would see action in Normandy, where some succeeded in destroying Allied vehicles. They would be used during the Warsaw Uprising, where Polish resistance fighters learned to cut their control cables. The technology worked, just not at Anzio. Chen returned to frontline duty on February 29th. His new position was 300 yards south of where he had fought during Operation Fischfang. The German lines were 200 yards away, close enough to hear enemy soldiers talking at night, close enough that artillery fire from both sides constantly threatened every position. The Anzio beachhead remained a killing ground through March and April. Random artillery strikes caused 83% of Allied casualties during this period. German railway guns fired from the Alban Hills, beyond the range of Allied counter-battery fire. Soldiers called the largest gun Anzio Annie. It fired 280mm shells that could destroy anything they hit. Morrison coordinated intelligence gathering from patrol reports and prisoner interrogations. The Germans were reinforcing their defensive positions, but showed no indication of launching another major offensive. Kesselring had recognized what Hitler refused to accept. The Anzio beachhead could not be eliminated through frontal assault. Both armies were now waiting. The Germans were waiting for the Allies to attempt a breakout they could defeat. The Allies were waiting for the spring offensive to break the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino. When that happened, German forces at Anzio would have to withdraw or risk encirclement. The stalemate continued until May 23, 1944. On that date, 1,500 Allied artillery pieces opened fire in a coordinated bombardment. The breakout from Anzio had begun. 6 Corps attacked with 7 divisions, including the reconstituted 45th Division. The objective was Valmontone, a town controlling Highway 6, the main German supply route. The Germans fought a delaying action, but could not stop the Allied advance. Rome fell on June 4, 1944. The Anzio campaign was over. It had cost the Allies 29,200 combat casualties and 37,000 non-combat casualties. The Germans lost an estimated 27,500 men. Chen survived the entire Anzio campaign. He would fight through the Gothic Line offensive later that year. He would enter Germany in April 1945. But Anzio remained the worst experience of his war. The constant artillery, the mud, the sense that both sides were bleeding each other to death for a stalemate nobody wanted. The captured Goliaths ended up in museums and military collections across the United States, physical reminders of the day Germany's wonder weapon failed before firing a single shot. Engineers studied them. Weapons designers learned from them. The remote-controlled demolition concept would evolve into modern military robotics decades later. But at Anzio in February 1944, the Goliaths represented something else. A reminder that technology alone cannot win battles, that terrain matters, that weather matters, that sometimes the simplest factors determine success or failure. The United States Army conducted formal after-action analysis of Operation Fischfang in June 1944. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors, examined captured German documents, and compiled comprehensive reports on enemy tactics. The Goliath section occupied 17 pages of technical documentation with photographs and diagrams. Allied intelligence determined that the Germans had planned to deploy 60 Goliaths at Anzio. Logistical problems reduced that number to 13. All 13 came from a single production batch manufactured at the Borgward factory in Bremen in November 1943. The devices were shipped to Italy in January 1944, specifically for use against the beachhead. German planning documents captured after Rome fell revealed the strategic thinking behind the Goliath deployment. Wehrmacht engineers had calculated that remote-controlled demolition vehicles could clear paths through Allied minefields and barbed wire defenses. They estimated each Goliath could neutralize up to 30 meters of fortified positions. 13 devices should have cleared 390 meters of breakthrough corridor. The calculations failed to account for soil conditions. German reconnaissance had photographed the Anzio area extensively. Aerial imagery showed fields, roads, and buildings, but photographs could not reveal that the fields were reclaimed marshland, that winter rains had saturated the ground, that anything heavier than a man would sink into mud. The failure was not unique to the Goliath program. German armor experienced similar problems throughout Operation Fischfang. Panther tanks bogged down. Tiger tanks became stuck. Even lighter vehicles struggled with the terrain. The entire offensive had been planned without adequate consideration of ground conditions. Morrison's intelligence reports emphasized this lesson. Technological superiority meant nothing if environmental factors were ignored. The most advanced weapon system could fail completely when deployed in unsuitable conditions. Future operations required comprehensive terrain analysis before committing specialized equipment. The British analyzed the Goliaths from a different perspective. They were developing their own remote-controlled demolition vehicles for the Normandy invasion. The Anzio failures provided valuable data. British engineers modified their designs to include wider tracks for better ground pressure distribution. They tested prototypes in muddy conditions before accepting them for operational use. American engineers took a different approach. Rather than develop remote-controlled vehicles, they focused on conventional methods. Combat engineers with explosive charges, tank-mounted dozers, armored bulldozers, technologies that had proven reliable in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The Goliath's failure reinforced American preference for simple, robust solutions over complex systems. German military planners never abandoned the Goliath concept despite the Anzio disaster. Production continued through September 1944. Later models included gasoline engines instead of electric motors, wider tracks for improved mobility, stronger control cables, less likely to break under stress. But the fundamental vulnerability remained. Any weapon dependent on cable control could be defeated by severing that cable. Normandy saw limited Goliath success on June 6, 1944. German defenders deployed small numbers on the invasion beaches. Most were destroyed by naval bombardment before they could engage Allied forces. A few managed to damage landing craft and vehicles, but artillery fire and small arms consistently severed their control cables. The Warsaw Uprising in August 1944 demonstrated the Goliath's effectiveness in urban combat. German forces used them to demolish Polish resistance strongpoints in destroyed buildings. The rubble provided concealment. Short engagement ranges reduced cable vulnerability. Polish fighters learned to ambush the devices and cut their cables, but not before Goliaths destroyed several fortified positions. Chen never learned what happened to the Goliaths he had encountered at Anzio. After the war, he returned to civilian life in California. He worked as a high school teacher for 37 years. He rarely discussed his wartime service. When students asked about World War II, he talked about the soldiers he had served with, the friends who had not come home, the price of victory. Morrison remained in the army after the war. He served in Korea as a battalion commander. He retired as a colonel in 1962. His intelligence reports from Anzio became required reading at the Army Command and General Staff College. The sections on terrain analysis and equipment suitability assessment influenced doctrine for decades. The 45th Division received the Presidential Unit Citation for their defense during Operation Fischfang. The citation recognized extraordinary heroism in holding defensive positions against overwhelming enemy attacks. The division had suffered the highest casualty rate of any American unit at Anzio. Their sacrifice had prevented German forces from splitting the beachhead and destroying 6th Corps. Modern military historians debate whether Operation Fischfang could have succeeded under different conditions. Some argue that Kesselring's offensive was doomed regardless of weather or terrain. The Allies had too much artillery, too much naval gunfire support, too much air superiority. Others suggest that hard ground and functional Goliaths might have created breakthrough opportunities. The consensus view holds that the Anzio beachhead's survival depended on multiple factors working in Allied favor. Determined defensive stands by units like the 45th Division, overwhelming artillery support, naval gunfire, air superiority, and mud that limited German mobility while hampering their newest weapons. The Goliaths represented one small element in a massive battle. Their failure did not determine the outcome of Operation Fischfang, but their story illustrated larger truths about warfare, technology, and the gap between planning and execution. The 13 Goliaths that failed at Anzio on February 16, 1944, represent more than a technological curiosity. They symbolize the unpredictability of combat, the impossibility of controlling every variable, the reality that nature often decides battles as decisively as generals or weapons. German engineers had designed the Goliath for specific tactical problems, clearing minefields without casualties, destroying fortified positions from safe distances, breaking through defensive lines that conventional forces could not penetrate. In laboratory conditions, on proving grounds, during demonstrations for Wehrmacht leadership, the devices performed exactly as intended. But war is not fought in laboratories. Anzio's reclaimed marshland, saturated by winter rains, transformed an innovative weapon into dead weight. The same mud that trapped Allied vehicles and German tanks stopped the wonder weapon before it traveled 100 feet. 60 kilograms of high explosives in each Goliath never detonated. The remote control advantage became irrelevant when the devices could not move. The broader lesson extended beyond one failed weapon system. Operation Fischfang itself demonstrated how environmental factors constrain military operations. Kesselring planned his offensive around narrow breakthrough corridors. He concentrated his forces on limited frontage. He committed his best divisions to the assault. Everything worked according to doctrine except the fundamental assumption that mechanized forces could maneuver effectively. They could not. The mud defeated German armor as thoroughly as it defeated the Goliaths. Panthers and Tigers bogged down. Infantry struggled through waterlogged terrain. Artillery positions sank into soft ground. The entire offensive operated at reduced effectiveness because nobody had adequately assessed soil conditions before the attack. The Allies benefited from the same mud that hindered German operations, but they also benefited from superior artillery, naval gunfire, and defensive positions prepared over 4 weeks of continuous work. The 45th Division held not because conditions favored them, but because soldiers like Chen refused to break despite impossible circumstances. 80 years later, the Goliath story survives in military museums and historical archives. One device sits in the Fort Knox Armor Museum. Another remains at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Several more are scattered across European museums. Each one carries a small plaque explaining what it is. Few plaques mention Anzio. Fewer still explain that all 13 failed before engaging their targets. The soldiers who faced the Goliaths, who captured them, who survived Operation Fischfang, are nearly all gone now. Chen passed away in 2003. Morrison died in 2008. The last veterans of the 45th Division at Anzio are in their late 90s or older. Soon, there will be no living memory of February 1944 at Anzio, which makes preserving these stories essential. Not just the famous battles, not just the successful operations, but the small details, the failed weapons, the mud that stopped wonder weapons, the soldiers who held impossible positions because they had no choice but to hold. History tends to remember technology that succeeded, the Sherman tank, the P-51 Mustang, the M1 Garand rifle. We forget the failures. But understanding what failed and why teaches as much as studying what worked. The Goliath failed at Anzio because planners ignored terrain. That lesson applies to every military operation since. The 13 remote-controlled mines that bogged down in Italian mud represented the future of warfare. Decades later, unmanned systems dominate modern battlefields. Drones, robots, remote-controlled vehicles that perform missions too dangerous for humans. The Goliath was primitive by current standards, but it was attempting in 1944 what became standard doctrine by the 21st century. Mother Nature stopped all 13 before they could prove whether the concept worked. But the concept itself was sound. Remote delivery of explosives to targets without risking operators. The execution failed. The idea endured. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers who held defensive lines with courage and artillery fire. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Chen and the men of the 45th Division don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.